welcome to another video. My name is James McCool. I'm the owner of PayDirtDFS.com, and this right here is Damascus. This is my son. I don't think that he's ever actually showed up on my YouTube channel before, but if he has, then that's awesome. You guys have met him, and if you haven't, then this is his debut. Hi. So yeah, there we go. He's going to be my special guest today. Today we are going to be making another video talking about some DFS concepts and some theory. So if you have not already checked out the site over at PayDirtDFS.com, you should do that. I have a lot of really cool stuff over there, really unique metrics, some really actionable stuff. All the posts on the site are free. There's some free research tables, and then for subscribers, you get really strong projection sets made with simulations and some really, really unique metrics. So you'll want to go do that. Today, we are going to be talking about how optimizers think, some optimizer logic, as well as how lineups are built and how you should handle one-offs. So I have a little demonstration made for you guys in Excel like I usually do, but for the most part we're going to be talking a little bit about how optimizers think when they're building your lineups and how you should be thinking about your lineups when you're building them so you can think like an optimizer. So without further ado, let's go ahead and get started. So how do optimizers think? What is optimizer logic? So optimizers in and of themselves are mostly just big calculators. Like, they don't really do anything that is especially special if you don't know how to make them do special things, right? So think of a TI-86 calculator that you had back in school. Yeah, like, you were able to do some really cool things with them. You were able to do some really cool graphing. You were able to put together some really cool statistics and do some really cool calculations. But if you didn't know how to do those calculations, then you wouldn't be able to put things together correctly, right? It would be a position where, you know, you would try to put together a graph, say if you were graphing like a parabolic equation or something like that. You would try to put it together and it just wouldn't work. And people would say, oh, well, it's pretty easy. You just do this, this, and this. And you could replicate what they do, but then you would still have troubles doing it on your own. Optimizers are the exact same way. Optimizers take a lot of skill to use. And one of the reasons why is because they're just putting out outputs based on the inputs that you put into them. Every optimizer that you find across the industry and anything that you can pay for or build yourself is just going to take inputs, projections, and players, and then an output of a knapsack problem, which is trying to optimize the projections or the ownership or whatever it is that you're optimizing for a maximum value for. There's some other values that we could go into. We could talk a little bit about local and global maximas. We could do stuff like that, but there's really no reason to here. This isn't really a video talking about how optimizers work. It's just a video talking about a little bit of the logic that optimizers use to build lineups. So with that being said, they're basically just big calculators. But what they do a lot of the time is they do have a priority stream that they go through. So an optimizer, and we're going to be talking specifically about baseball today, but this can apply to any DFS sport, and you can think about it in the same way. So optimizers are mostly going to say, where is the value first? Well, first they're going to take user inputs, right? So if you say that you want to lock a player, say you want to lock Mike Trout or Giancarlo Stanton or something like that, first it's going to take those user inputs, and it's going to consider those things first. And then after that, it's going to say, okay, so I have the user inputs now. Where's the value that I can utilize the most? Like, what players are the most valuable? What players are going to give me the highest projection for the salary that I have to pay to use them? So the optimizer is then going to go value. And then after it does value, then it's going to say, okay, where else can I spend money at? So it will go user inputs and then value, and then it'll say, where can I spend the rest of my cash, right? So usually that's when we start getting into the pitchers, specifically for baseball, and then one-offs, right? So this question came up the other day in the Discord, which is free to join. By the way, you can find the link on the site. But the question came up of the game theory behind if a position is very weak, let's call it second base in this instance, and there is one stud that stands out above the rest, and there are some punts that look good, and then there's just nothing in the mid-range, what do you do? So that question is kind of hard to answer. It answers itself based on the contest that you're in. It answers it based on what the rest of the lineup looks like. first off, you'd always want to go with correlation when it comes to baseball first, but then after that, do you choose the punt or do you choose the expensive player, the one that actually projects well? So how would an optimizer handle this, right? An optimizer would go through and run your stacks first. It would run user inputs first, and then it would build the best stack that it can, and then it would pick the pitchers, and then it would say who are the rest of the one-offs, right? So that second baseman would be a one-off unless it was already part of your stack. So let's consider it not being part of your stack. In this case, the thing that is going to happen is it is going to start with your stack, and if your stack is expensive and there is no value in the stack, say this is like every player is averaging 4,500 or more in cost across the stack, then very likely you're going to go with a punt at that second base position because it represents value that is not found in the rest of the lineup, and optimizers need value in order to create effective lineups. Yeah. So, if you have a cheap stack, on the other hand, if your stack averages around $3,000 to $3,500 per player, right, then in that case, you're very likely to go with the expensive player, right, Damascus? You're very likely to go with the stud because now the optimizer has said, okay, well, where's the value? Oh, it's already there in the stack. I can spend the rest of the cap on important players rather than going with a weak mid-range or going with a punt. So that's kind of the priority order. It's going to go user inputs first, and then it's going to say, where's my value? And then if it's already satisfied the value, then it's going to fill out the rest of the one-offs. So you would be thinking in the same way when it comes to your one-off in this certain specific question, right? Like, you would be wanting to look at it like, all right, so if I have already built out this lineup and I have to make a choice between, say, Jose Altuve and, I don't know, some cheap second baseman that is okay and represents fine value, after you have built your stack out, that's when you make that decision, right? Like, after the stack, you're going to be saying, okay, I have enough money to afford Jose Altuve, or no, I don't. I need to still fill out my pitchers, and second base is going to have to wait, so it's very likely that you're going to have to punt. So there's the explanation. We can also go ahead and go look at a little example here, right? So here is a very small, very simple build-up that I made, okay? So we have stack prices here, we have pitcher prices here, and then we're going to say, okay, what is the average fill based on what we do on this very macro example, right? So if we have two cheap options here between your stack and your pitcher or pitchers if you're on DraftKings, that is both going to be A, they both cost $15K. Your average fill out for the rest of the pieces in the lineup is going to be $6,600. Now that's a pretty extreme example. It's going to be unlikely that you're able to fill out all of this and have enough value to do this as well. So let's say that the stack is actually a little bit more expensive, right? Actually, let's just say that the stack is super expensive. So now we have a stack that costs $25K out of our cap. So consider something like the Yankees, right? The Yankees are a very expensive stack to make. And then we have two cheap pitchers, or cheaper pitchers, right? These are $7,500 on average. And then that's going to leave you $3,300 on average to fill out the rest of the lineup with your one-offs or with your secondary stack. So your one-offs in your secondary stack at this point are likely going to have to be punts and not mid-range. Maybe you can afford one mid-range player and then two punts, or two punts and one more expensive player, but you're going to have to punt at one of the fill-in spots for your secondary and your one-offs. Now, if you were to have two mid-range, right, so you have a relatively expensive stack and a relatively expensive pitcher, then you run into the same issue. If you have a relatively expensive stack and a really expensive combo of pitchers, that doesn't work, right? But if you go with a cheaper stack and expensive pitchers, then we have this average $3,300. If you go with a relatively cheap pitcher set, which is $20K, I guess $25K isn't really feasible in DraftKings unless you have Jacob deGrom and Corbin Burns. So let's actually change this. Let's go 12,500, 15K, and 17,500. Or actually, yeah, we'll go 20K here. So yeah, there we go. All right. So now, when you end up going with a really expensive stack and a cheaper, or a really cheap stack and really expensive pitchers, then you end up having $5,000 per average on fill. right? If you end up going with a relatively mid-range stack, then you end up having 3,300. And so that's where we start running into problems when you have expensive and expensive. So in these cases, you can think of it from a macro point of view. If you have a cheap stack and expensive pitchers, then you're very likely still going to have to punt one spot with the rest of your lineup, and an optimizer would think the same way. If you have cheap pitchers and a relatively cheap stack, so that mid-range stack, then you probably can afford to pay up a little bit at your one-offs in your secondary stack. But the concept to keep in mind here is that your one-offs and your secondary stack come after the priorities of your pitchers and your stack that you're creating. So that's just a little example. I wanted to go over that a little bit, just give a little bit of a visual, but for the most part, this is not going to be a long video. It's just talking a little bit about the optimization steps that an optimizer would take and how you can think the same way. Thinking like an optimizer is a really important thing to do if you're hand building, especially in correlative sports like MLB and NHL. It's even more important in NBA. Now, there are other parts of this that come into play, right? When you are thinking about things like this is just the first level, right? This is just how to build a lineup that is competitive. After that, then you have to start to think, okay, so what is everybody else going to be doing, right? If I know that the expensive stacks are the popular stacks, say that it's the Yankees and the Toronto Blue Jays or something like that are going to be the chalk, and there is either a punt or a pay up at second base, it's very likely that punt is going to be disproportionately highly owned just because it allows you to fit the Blue Jays and the Yankees. So try to think of it that way and then say, okay, do I really want to eat extra ownership on this cheap second baseman just so that I can afford these expensive stacks? Or do I want to go a little bit off the board and try to have a cheaper stack and then have the pay up at second base who is just as good of a play per dollar but is more expensive? So that's the second level, is thinking about what it means for other people when they're creating their lineups. If it's expensive lineups, the cheaper player is likely going to be disproportionately higher owned than the stud. If they're cheaper stacks, then the stud is likely to be disproportionately higher owned than the punt, right? Because people are going to have the money to actually be able to afford the second baseman stud. Hopefully you can take this and try to apply it to different things. You can apply it to things like NBA, where if there are expensive guards on the slate, it's very likely that center and forward are going to be in the cheaper options. So you can utilize that information and know that you can plug in you can plug in the more expensive forwards and have some of the cheaper guards, and that way it'll differentiate you without lowering your threshold projection all that much. So hopefully this gives you a little bit more to think about in terms of how to more think like an optimizer when you're hand building your lineups. I can do some more videos on this kind of stuff. I really like talking about the stuff, and maybe next time I'll be able to have a little bit better of an example to be built up. But if you like this stuff, then then subscribe to the YouTube channel and give me a like. If you have not checked out paydirtdfs.com, you should do that. You can use the code ALLSTAR, all caps, at checkout on a monthly subscription and get $5 off your first month. We're going into the All-Star break. There's not going to be much MLB, but we are going to have some NFL content over there. I'm going to be writing some articles based on the NFL season-long projections that went up this week. So if you haven't checked those things out, please do. Give me a shout-out. Go follow me on Twitter, all those things. I appreciate you guys' support, and I will talk to you guys next time.